Welcome to the Enneagram with Chelsea and Nicoel. This is a positively deviant culture podcast anchored in the Enneagram. In this episode, we're continuing our conversation about the type 5 and going to be talking about their movement points. But before that, a quick reminder.
Every episode, I want to remind listeners that this isn't a prescriptive fixed tool and that our conversations are designed to work with the material and ideas in an exploratory way. So as long as I've been working with the Enneagram, my knowledge and application continues to evolve. And that's what we're here trying to do, is to learn together.
I love that you use the word exploration because in very initial conversations, when we did some intro episodes, we talked about the Enneagram as sort of a 3D map for the landscape of the human soul, you really could say. And as we think about movement points and the way that a 5 moves to their integration and disintegration points, the reason we're having this portion of the conversation is to really fill out what the personality of a type 5 looks like as we all move in stressful moments and when we're super grounded and just absolutely crushing it. Let's talk first a little bit more about the movements and what they represent from your perspective.
So the movements are typically taught in one direction, that every type integrates to one type. In this case, for 5, it would be to an 8 and disintegrates to another type. And in this case, for a 5, it would be a 7. However, in the more advanced learning, and this is how I like to present it, is that it actually goes both directions, meaning that each type integrates and disintegrates to both types. So in this case, for a 5, it would be integrating and disintegrating to both 8 and 7. And the reason why I teach it this way is I think there's some hidden insights and there's treasures in here, and it's a deeper reality. The reality is that we actually move to all of the types, but these particular points, these are primary movement points for each type. There's 2 of them, and it exposes a more complete picture of what's going on with each type at their core as we investigate their points of movement.
The movement points are really helpful for me to understand what's happening for someone when I notice maybe an outward expression or there's something happening even for them internally. And I'm like, what is that? Right. And it's like, oh, they're likely to take on these 2 other types in the best and worst case scenarios. It also provides a map for human growth and how we can take on a more whole formation starting with these 2 types. And then of course the goal is all 9 types.
That's perfect. It's exactly right. 5s, when they are stressed out or disintegrated, will take on the worst characteristics of both a 7 and an 8. And I will start with the worst of a 7. So the worst of a 7 is being super selfish, immediate, very compulsive, not having a lot of impulse control, self-medicating. They do not do delayed gratification at all. And having commitment issues, being super expressive in terms of partying and pushing the limits, and can go towards adrenaline, junkie, and anything that is expressing their freedom and their agency. And often, like I said, in selfish ways that are destructive and extreme, and very much trying to party and have fun. And so the drive at the worst of a 7 is to have fun at all costs and to be free at all costs, and can be inconsiderate of others in that selfish drive, and also kind of the need to self-soothe as the worst of a 7. And the worst of an 8 is to prove one's personal power, which is a little different than what a 7's doing in terms of proving freedom. Those can look very similar. The worst of an 8 is also this kind of dominating, I can do whatever I want, whenever I want, don't get in my way, aligning with people who are strong and powerful, dismissing everyone else. 8s at their worst can be very dismissive, impatient, incredibly heartless. They can be heartless and cold. And so the worst of an 8 can also be using too much energy that is not necessary and overly pushing externally in the environment to test who is strong and who is weak and taking too much control and dominating the circumstance.
I find it so interesting that both of those types have such strong externalized actions and behaviors, because what we already talked about with the 5, where so much of what's happening for them is internal. But let's keep rolling. And also just a reminder to people, you're so good at reminding people that this is like intentionally being really extreme. And it's a beginning point. So this is not how people are necessarily acting all the time. There's just little gestures towards these behaviors that are part of the package, not the whole thing.
Yes. The interesting thing about these movement points for 5 is exactly what you said, in the sense that 5s are very internalized. They can be withdrawers. They're actually the most independent of all the types, and yet their movement points are incredibly intense. Both 7s and 8s are externally very intense and actually quite similar in terms of impatient, impulsive, dominating, and very self-expressive and fearless in terms of the external factor. And so you're right that it can create a distinct balance for 5's internal withdrawn state, that the points of movement are more extremely opposite than they are for other types.
And I've known a 5 and experienced this kind of externalized behavior. And this is why we're having this conversation, is actually to explain what you might see on the surface looking like this externalized 7 or 8 behavior is actually not the case. I know it's of utmost importance, because of the power of the Enneagram, to get it right. By understanding these movement points, we can actually stop and check ourselves to say, just because we're seeing that doesn't mean that that's where it's actually coming from.
That's right. We can misidentify easily, with movement points, which is another reason why we talk about them initially, because they're easy to misidentify. Speaking on that matter, what I notice about the movement points, particularly with 5s, because 5s tend to be so withdrawn and more independent and quite quiet, generally speaking, right? And yet they have this opposite mode. When they get into social situations, they can be very lively and look very 7-like in this movement, where they're verbose and engaged and not at all withdrawn. Many 5s I notice that I've come in contact with do not exhibit obvious 8 stuff. However, when they're in a state of stress, they definitely will express arrogance and domination and dismissiveness and intolerance that is externalized and lobbed on like bombs, like very destructive. Just because it's infrequent doesn't mean that it's not there. And so this is what we're addressing, is trying to show that things are a little less visible sometimes in the movement. And especially for 5s, when it looks very similar, meaning 7s and 8s can show up very similarly. So the distinctions and the nuances are not at all obvious here.
Yeah. And if you're going to move to 2 types that look similar, then the person who's experiencing that behavior is going to naturally assume that there's a lot of that present and could easily misidentify.
That's right. Another thing that comes to mind too is all of the other movement points of every other type. There's more balance in the movement. That 5s have the most intense points of integration and disintegration. And I find this fascinating in terms of just coming off of the conversation around brilliance. The amount of energy and capacity that's necessary to bring the brilliances of a 5 in terms of omniscience and original thinking and invention, right? And being able to sit in the void and embrace death. Like some of these, wisdom 5s need these 2 connection points in order to fulfill that job, because it is so intense. There's some magnificent design here in terms of what's necessary for 5s, that it happens to be, exist in helping them in their 2 places of movements, which is the same for all of us, right? Like the places that we most primarily move to, the integration and disintegration points, are the very points that we need to fulfill our job more brilliantly, more accurately, more credibly, and with greatness and excellence. And what comes to mind for me as an 8, one of my movement points is a 5. And I very much sit in this place of five stuff. And I feel like that I'm very proud of that because I'm not a five, right? And so to be able to exist in the world of complexities and the matrix, and one of the things that I actually didn't mention in the brilliance that fives are amazing at is finding contradiction and locating points of disparity. And these are some of the secret spaces. So as an eight, moving to a five, that's very important for me in my work to be able to bring to the world, is to have that 5 point, and also my two. But in this case, for a five, it is really clear the more we investigate, like how important the energy of a seven and an energy of an eight is in order for them to do their work. And now this is a perfect segue into the best of a seven and an eight.
And it sounds like the fives are doing so much of this, like taking a big problem and solving it, and it's all internal. And I know that that's very true for eights too, but there's a different energy propelling them to solve the world's problems in an external way. And so you can absolutely see how both of those things are necessary to not just stay in the knowledge, but to actually bring that knowledge to life in the world.
Well, that is an excellent point, Chelsea, is that when they're not very integrated, will not activate their knowledge in the world. It will remain in an internal places. And in order to activate that kind of intensity of knowledge and truth and all of these things, you're absolutely right. It was a really insightful comment. The external power of a seven and eight is required to move something so internal and weighty that is invisible to the physical world, requires the intensity of a seven and eight.
Okay, let's move on to the best of the 7 and 8 now.
Okay. The best of a seven is that sevens teach us about joy and freedom. They teach us that the world and ourselves, we are limitless, that there is an expansiveness and areas that we don't even know exist. Sevens are the ones that go where no man has gone before. They're the ultimate explorers externally in the world, the ultimate adventurers that are able to take on extreme circumstances fearlessly and with curiosity and with enormous amount of energy in excitement. So sevens are the ones that bring joy. They are interested in reducing the suffering of others because they don't like pain and they want to reduce the pain and bring joy. And so sevens are the best explorers and also innovators in the external world. And so here we have this combination of fives are the explorers of the internal world and of the invisible and the unknowable. And sevens are the ultimate explorers of the external world, of what's visible and physical. So this combination we can see is really important. And, also for sevens, to go to their five self in very similar value here.
It's beautifully complementary. And it's so nice to see the similarities because that also helps us unpack the nuances and how it's actually slightly different, or in many cases, very different.
Yes. And here, the brilliance of an eight. So the brilliance of an eight as common metaphor is the defibrillators, the ones who bring the dead back to life, the ultimate rise of the phoenix and resurrection, and are able to overcome the biggest obstacles and to win wars and move mountains and to have the energy source to be metaphorically bombs. Eights can, have enough energy to go nuclear. And that is a metaphorical, power source to do extreme and intense and the most necessary things when those arise, right? And also teach us ultimately at their best about mercy and able to protect the innocent and able to protect those who are in need and bring a certain balance and justice through their power, right? Which is a form of mercy. So, both of these are very similar in a way, but as this culminates, I think at the place of an eight, in terms of like all of what's necessary to externalize things in powerful ways that really require going against the standards of what exists, right? Like if you're going to see things that no one else is seeing, if you're going to exist in the matrix where most people cannot perceive, never mind understand, and how to bring those things into a physical world that actually matters, you have to have an enormous amount of intensity of power and control and drive and desire. Both the 7 and an 8 is what provide that for a 5.
And I think about the 7's limitless possibility and then attribute that in the way that a 5 is encompassing it. And it's the limitless possibility of thinking and knowledge and discovery and curiosity. The more that we talk about these, the more apparent it becomes that each of these parts is necessary to have the full picture and the complementary package.
Yep. And then we can extrapolate this to, how important it is to have all 9 types in us. The other thing that 8s bring 5s is, 8s are very located in their bodies. We are very physical, immediate creatures because we exist in our bodies, and 5s tend to be less embodied in general. I mean, at their best, that's what they are, is embodied. And that is a very different experience in terms of the power of their concepts and constructs, is that it has to be physical. It has to exist in the physical world. And so that's a part of the 8 that 5s are able to use, which is essential. And then 7s, their levity and the fact that they can be experimenting in ways that are generative because they're playful. That's something that I noticed, that when 5s are really integrated, move to the 7, they can be more playful. So, and again, play is its own form of exploration, right? So you have all of these resources in 7 and 8 that provide 5s a lot of material and energy that they can work with. It's like different tools for them that can open up new doors and new universes that without, they're more limited.
You and I have spoken about necessary qualities for innovation and are going to be having a future conversation about what underpins innovation, but both 5s and 7s are likely leaders from an innovative perspective when you think about the personality traits that one naturally encompasses. And I think what you've just talked about when it comes to play is a really great example of how innovation comes to life through this willingness to try on different ideas that might sound or seem absolutely ridiculous, but can lead us to new insights, new discoveries, and original thinking.
It's beautifully said. I mean, 7s teach us to be absurd. They are unafraid of the absurd. They're unafraid of playing the fool. What's very interesting about this, and this is the movement, right? When 7s go to 5 and when 5s go to 7, when they, meet each other there, it is the place of ultimate wisdom. If you can't play the fool, you generally can't get to the deepest places of wisdom. And yet, if you only play the fool, you can't get to the deepest places of wisdom. They are very much the missing pieces of each other. And this is, all 9 types. We are all of each other's missing pieces.
Yeah. And you're already starting to hint at some of the paradoxes. So before we wrap up and get on to the conversation about the paradoxes of the 5, is there anything else to add on the movement points?
No, I think we've got it. Yeah, I think
perfect.
Yeah, we've got it.
Okay, well, thank you so much for listening. If you're interested in learning more about the Enneagram or working with us, you can find the link to our LinkedIn in the show notes. We would also love if you subscribe. That way you'll get notifications for future episodes.